This message is a presentation of Pinnacle Baptist Church and the preaching ministry of Pastor Ray McBarry. Other messages like this are available online at pinnaclebaptist.com. The church is located at 2517 High Falls Road in Griffin, Georgia. If you're in the area, we would love for you to visit us this Sunday. Now, here's today's message.
All right, well, last week we began going through Daniel chapter number 1, and the preacher did do a real good job of explaining that we were going to begin our verse-by-verse study in Daniel chapter 1 because we had the funeral last Sunday evening, and so we did record last week's Bible study in the book of Daniel. So if you weren't here with us last Sunday evening, it was probably the preacher's fault for not making that clear, but you can listen to it. If you need a copy of it on DVD, let me know. We'll get you a copy on CD so that you can carry it and listen to it either at home or in the car. We also have it online on the church's Facebook page. You can listen to it online right there. Well, we got through Daniel chapter 1 down through verse 16. And obviously I won't reteach all of last week's lesson, but just to kind of give everyone a nutshell version of what we covered last week. In Daniel chapter 1, we have the explanation of how King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians besieged the city of Jerusalem. They carried away captive part of the king's family and some of the other royal families, the wealthy families, the nobility of Judah, if you would, carried their children back to Babylon. And then we talked about a number of reasons they did this, but mainly taking the families of the king and the nobility back made it less likely that any revolt or rebellion would spring up now that Judah is under the control, more or less, of King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Because if a revolt was going to grow up, it probably would be led by the children of the previous king or some of those noble families who thought that they had a right to rule Judah as well, and looking for an opportunity for themselves to become the new kings of Judah. So rather than allow that to happen, King Nebuchadnezzar did what many of those in the ancient world did. When he conquered them, he took the children of all those who might rise up in rebellion, took them back to Babylon, and now they're going to be trained, educated as Babylonians. He also took in later, the other two times that he besieged the city after that, he took many of the inhabitants of the land of Judah and scattered them throughout the Babylonian Empire, because with them away from their own land and scattered so that there weren't a whole bunch of them in any one place, they would be less likely to revolt and rebel as well. So the reason Daniel and his three companions find themselves in Babylon is because Daniel was a child of the nobility there in Judah. And so were his three companions that we read so much about. And so the Babylonians undertook the process of taking these young people from Judah and making them, or we should say remaking them, into good Babylonians. So the first thing they did was to change their names. We talked about how the names of Daniel and all three of his companions had previously been names that were in some way related to Jehovah God. We gave the meaning for each of their names. And then we saw how the Babylonians changed those names and gave them all names that had something to do with one or another of the different Babylonian gods that the Babylonians worshiped. So that when they heard their name called, no longer would they think about the God of their fathers, but they would think about the God of the Babylonians for whom they had been renamed. He was part of this cultural immersion to change them from being Jews or Judahites into being Babylonians. Part of that also entailed educating them, re-educating them into the language, the customs, and the sciences known to the Babylonians. Part of that also involved treating them like royalty. What person who's treated well, given a fancy title and a nice paycheck every month, is going to want to rise up and revolt or rebel against the king? So these children of the nobility of Judah, not only were they given new names, given a new education, but they were, the Babylonians were training them to take over important offices in the bureaucracy of Babylon. So they were going to be given important titles and positions, making them even that much more loyal to Babylon and to the king of Babylon, instead of remembering their own heritage, like we talked about last week. They would be made over time, if the process worked, to forget their own heritage and from where they had come, and they would just become good Babylonians. That was the goal anyway. Well, part of the process is that they were going to be treated well and treated to the same fancy foods that even the king of Babylon was treated to. And they were told that they could have of the king's meat and of the king's wine. Well, it wasn't just Daniel and the 3 companions that were his close friends, but all of those young people that had been brought back over to Babylon from Jerusalem and Judah. And so when they were presented with this opportunity to fare sumptuously at the king's table with all of his food, many of the other children of Israel apparently went right along with it and ate everything that was put on the table and drank the king's wine. Daniel and his 3 companions said, "No, not us." God has given us very strict guidelines as to what to eat and what not to eat. We talked briefly about how some of the items that were foods were things that good Jews weren't supposed to eat. Going back to the Mosaic law, God gave Moses at Mount Sinai. Some of those dietary laws are recorded in Leviticus chapter 11, if you want to go back and read them. But it would have prohibited barbecue pork sandwiches. It would have prohibited fried catfish and a lot of the other things that you and I like to eat as well. They were not supposed to eat those things. We also talked about the fact that these foods that were prepared for the king's table would also have been offered in part as sacrifices to the false gods of the Babylonians, dedicated to the false gods of the Babylonians, and a blessing said over the food for the king's table in the name of these false gods of the Babylonians. And Daniel and his companions, they didn't want any part of meats and foods that had been offered, I'm sure, to the false gods of Babylon. So Daniel Daniel, I can't think of the right word, Daniel requested that he and his 3 companions be allowed to just eat pulse as a trial run for 10 days. We talked about pulse being just grains and vegetables. He said, let us eat pulse for 10 days. The fellow who was in charge of their well-being said, no, I can't let you eat just that, because if the king checks on all of you and finds that you and your companions don't look as fat and happy as the rest of the children of Judah, I'm going to be in trouble, and it could be my head because of it. And Daniel said, let's just try it for 10 days. I guess the fellow figured that what could happen in 10 days will just catch up if it doesn't go as Daniel thinks it will. So he agreed for 10 days to let them just eat pulse. And the Bible said that at the end of the 10 days, they fared well. Verse 16 said, thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. That brings us down to where we left off, verse 17, as we finish up chapter 1. And as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. In all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So we see that not only did they look better, healthier after the 10-day trial, but when the 3 years was up and they were all brought in before King Nebuchadnezzar to see how they had grown in their knowledge of Babylonian customs and culture and language, but also how intelligent they all were, he found that Daniel and the 3 companions of his were 10 times above and beyond the comprehension and wisdom of all of his wise men in the whole realm of Babylon. And so that, of course, speaks well not only of Daniel and his 3 companions, but of the fact that because they were trying to honor God, God blessed them. I won't preach on it, but the stand they took on this issue of not eating things God had told them not to eat, the fact that they had the courage and the faith to take a stand on this thing that seems relatively insignificant in the whole big scheme of things, certainly it has something to do with the fact that later on in the book of Daniel, each of them will find the courage and the faith to take a stand on bigger issues when they come up. We talked about briefly, if they hadn't had the faith and courage to stand on something that was seemingly small, would they have ever summoned the faith and courage to take a stand on big things when those things came up? I think there's a lesson for all of us to be learned. So that brings us down to Daniel chapter 2. Yes, ma'am.
I got a question. Did they have the same food like we have today to eat?
I think probably so, Miss Mary.
I think they did gardens back then.
Absolutely, of course. And, you know, in different parts of the world, there are different types of foods that are prepared and different ways of preparing food. That's why we have Greek food, Italian food, Mexican food, and Asian food, Indian food, Chinese food, etc. So I'm sure there were some unique things to the food in that particular part of the world that we might not be as familiar with. But I think pretty much anything that was there and available was probably put on the king's table at some time or another. Now, as we begin Daniel chapter 2, we're going to see in this chapter some of the first prophetical things that are presented in the book of Daniel. As you'll remember from our introduction, the first week of our study, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are mostly history of things that are happening during the lifetime of Daniel. The second half of the book, the latter 6 chapters, deal almost entirely with prophetical things concerning the end times especially. But here we are, we're still in the first 6 chapters, which is mostly historical things. But chapter 2, we haven't even really gotten good into the book. We're going to get our first glimpse, our first peek at some prophetical things that have to do with the end times and events yet to come in Daniel's day. If I were writing this book, I couldn't have written it in a more interesting way. If Daniel were writing this without the help of the Holy Spirit, he couldn't have written it in a more interesting way because, you know, one of those things about reading a book, if you read it for a while and you don't come to something that really strikes your fancy and gets your attention, you're probably going to close it, put it down, and go move on to something else. Well, we're only in the 2nd chapter here. We're about to get into some good stuff, so to speak, some prophecy. So let's look at Daniel chapter number 2, verse 1. All right, chapter 2, verse 1. And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. All right, now I know we've only gotten through 2 verses, but if I could direct your attention up here to the whiteboard, just a little bit of further introduction before we move on to the rest of the chapter. I've drawn this basic map of the Middle East region where we have Jerusalem and the land of Israel. Then we have the 2 rivers that we've talked about so often before. Here's the Tigris and the Euphrates. The city of Babylon was situated right on the Euphrates River. Over here is the city of Jerusalem that was besieged by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and from whence Daniel and his 3 companions were taken back to Babylon. Just a few other things for reference on the map. Here's Asia Minor, which is Turkey up to the north. Here's Egypt down here with the Nile River, the Sinai Peninsula. And so Daniel and the Hebrew children were taken back to Babylon. Now, we see here that in verse 1 and 2, it says that the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dreams. Now, the Babylonians, you'll see very often in the Old Testament, not only in the book of Daniel but elsewhere, the Babylonians are sometimes also referred to as the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were the people who, in early history after the flood, occupied this southern part of Mesopotamia. Remember, Mesopotamia being the land between the 2 rivers. This southern part, which was very fertile land, was called the land of the Chaldees, or the Chaldeans. There's another city that we studied about when we were in the book of Genesis that is right down here, where I drew this bigger dot, near where these 2 both flow into together, the Tigris and Euphrates. Can you remember a city from the book of Genesis where someone came from the city of blank of the Chaldees? That's right, TR. You are of the Chaldees. That city with the great big name, Sounds like you got something in your throat. Of the Chaldees. Who was it in the book of Genesis who originally came from of the Chaldees? Abraham is right. That's right. Abraham's hometown had been of the Chaldees. So Abraham, before God called him out of was related to these people. He was a Chaldean himself. And so these people, the Chaldeans, they're a Semitic people, just like the Israelites are. Semitic simply means they're from the lineage of Noah's son, Shem. Shemites or Semites, from which we get the name, the term Semitic. So they're somewhat very, very distantly related to the Israelites, at least if you go all the way back to Noah's 3 sons. So this is the land of the Chaldees right here, or the Chaldeans. As we talked about in that first week of introduction to the book of Daniel, before Babylon became a major empire, you had another empire up here to the north, in the northern part of Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire is the one that had its capital up here at Nineveh, that city that Jonah was told to go and preach to. Jonah didn't want to go because he wanted God just to destroy the Ninevites and the Assyrians. He didn't like them because he knew that the northern kingdom of Israel was going to be conquered by the Assyrians. But God allowed the Assyrians to conquer the northern kingdom of Israel back in 721 BC because of Israel's idolatry and their wickedness. So the Assyrians are the ones that early on had conquered the northern kingdom, but not the southern kingdom of Judah. But the Assyrian Empire was much larger than that, and also had taken over pretty much all of Mesopotamia. The Babylonian Empire actually had grown up by revolting against the Assyrians, and the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar's daddy, Nabopolassar, had carved out a kingdom of his own and started the Babylonian kingdom, or the Babylonian Empire. It eventually, in time, incorporated most of what had previously been the old Assyrian Empire, plus a little bit of extra territory added on down here in Judah. But the Chaldeans, they were the Babylonians. They're almost synonymous with the Babylonians because even though the Chaldeans were just to the south of the ancient city of Babel, or Babylon, they were related to those peoples, and they're the ones who took over the city of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's daddy, Nabopolassar, was the one who took over Babylon and set it up as the capital of his kingdom of the Chaldeans. So that's who the Chaldeans are. They're an ancient people. They go back to pretty much not too long after the flood. And you remember that Babylon is also the city that was founded as Babel right after the flood. It was founded by what individual after the flood? TR? Nimrod. That's correct. We'll come back to him in just a little while. Verse 2 said, though, the king had this dream in his sleep. It troubled him. It was a nightmare. It woke him up. He didn't know what to make of the dream. So he calls in these groups: magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. Now, Chaldeans, being used in this sense, means the most educated of the Chaldeans. The ones who were, they were the ones that had been sent to school to get the most learning. All of the people here, in a sense, were Chaldeans that were from here. This is talking about not the ethnic group of Chaldeans, but the highly educated who served the king. His own people that were highly educated. Those are the Chaldeans. I don't think I have to explain too much who these other groups are. Magicians. Why, we've seen magicians down in Egypt when we study the book of Exodus and Moses going before Pharaoh. Remember, even Pharaoh had his magicians too, who could do tricks, sleight of hand type things. They were not equal to the miracles that God performed with the 10 plagues that were brought upon Egypt, but they looked similar. They looked like the miracles God performed. Magicians are good at sleight of hand things. That's what magicians do. Astrologers, now they're the ones who study the stars and claim to be able to foretell the future or predict events by watching the stars. The truth is, what TR mentioned a moment ago about Nimrod back at Babylon sort of ties in here. Because the ancient Babylonians and the Chaldeans, they had this history of believing in their religion and their culture that you could predict the future and foretell events by reading the stars. That goes back to ancient Babel before God even confounded the languages and spread the people throughout the earth. If you were here, some of you, I think, on Wednesday nights this past summer, we studied Mystery Babylon, the ancient mystery religions that started at the Tower of Babel, which formed the basis for all the ancient religions all over the world whenever they spread out. All of those ancient religions tie in to some degree with the religion that started at the Tower of Babel before God spread everyone out. part of that religion had to do with the worship of the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's why all of those ancient religions have that belief that the chief god is embodied by the sun. The ancient Babylonians referred to the sun god as Bel, B-E-L, for whom Daniel was renamed. The Canaanites who lived here in the land of Israel before the Israelites, they called that same sun god Baal, B-A-A-L. We see him all throughout the Old Testament, the false god Baal. The Romans referred to him as Saturn. The Greeks referred to him as Kronos. So all the ancient religions had the belief in these same gods and goddesses, and they all had to do with the worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars. The ancient Babylonians also worshipped the moon goddess. Her name, Ishtar. And Nebuchadnezzar actually had a gate built that Saddam Hussein had excavated and rebuilt during his reign in Iraq later on, called the Ishtar Gate. Ishtar is the one from whom we get the word Easter. She was the moon goddess of these ancient pagan religions, though she was known by different names in different other religions. But the English version of her name is Easter. It's the same as the name Ishtar. So the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, worshiped the sun, the moon, and the stars, and believed you could predict future events by watching and reading the stars. That's astrology. Now, there's a difference between astronomy and astrology. At least we're told there's a difference. Astrology is where you're trying to predict the future by reading the stars. That's not too much different than palm reading, the horoscope, which is what the stars are predicting, and fortune telling. Astronomy is the science of studying the stars. What are the stars made of? How far away are they? What is the sun and the moon? Etc., etc. Now, I have to be honest with you. I grew up learning in science class that astronomy and astrology are two different things. Up until 500 years ago, they were one and the same. There was no difference. And the more I study modern-day astronomy for the last 500 years, the more convinced I am they're still not too much different today than they were back then. But astrology is the study of the heavenly bodies with the belief that you could use them to foretell the future or predict events that are upcoming. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, awakens him out of his sleep. He wants to know what does it mean? He calls in the magicians. He calls in the astrologers. He calls in the Chaldeans, the most learned men of his council. He calls in the sorcerers. The word sorcery comes from the same term as our word pharmacy. It has to do with the use of pharmaceuticals, drugs, and of course, drug-inducing states, etc. So these are the fellas he calls in and says, listen, you guys are the ones that are supposed to be able to answer things for the king that nobody else can answer. I want some answers. And he means business. Look at verse number 3. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. All right? It says that the Chaldeans, that's all of these fellows kind of lumped together, they speak to him in Syriac. Not that it's real important, but just to let you know, Syriac is the language that was spoken of in the old Assyrian Empire. And it is a version of the language that was spoken of in this entire area in ancient times, called Aramaic. Interestingly enough, a version of Aramaic is still the language that was being spoken right here in Jesus' day and time. These folks spoke a version of Aramaic. They spoke a version of Aramaic. And apparently, these Chaldeans who are speaking to King Nebuchadnezzar, they're speaking to him in the language of these people, which is the Syriac language. I don't think it should be too surprising to us that they were speaking a language from the old Assyrian Empire, because that's probably who had forced the language on them and made them use the language. It's the language they had grown up with, so that's why they're speaking to the king in the Syriac language, which is from the Aramaic family that everyone in that part of the world spoke. That's not overly important, but it's interesting. So they said, "King, tell us what your dream was, and we'll tell you what it means." After all, that's why he called him in, right? Look at verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "The thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill." He said, if you can't tell me the dream and what it means, it's off with your head, and your houses, we're going to turn it into a cesspool, and it'll be the local, the local outhouse. That's what he replies to them. Now, what he's asked of them is that they tell him not only the interpretation, but what was the dream itself. And of course, they came to him and said, "King, tell us what you dreamed, and we'll tell you what it means." He said, "No, not so easy. I've forgotten what the dream is. I can't even remember what it is. But it was so bad, it awakened me. You tell me what it is. You tell me what I dreamed. After all, you're the magicians, the astrologers, the soothsayers, the sorcerers, and the most learned men of the Chaldeans. You tell me what I dreamed, because I've forgotten it. By the way, if you don't, you're all a bunch of phonies, and I know what to do with phonies." Yes, sir, go right ahead.
Some people don't realize, not only he's talking about them personally, but they talk about their whole entire family and servants.
That's right. You're exactly right. And we'll see that in a later story in Daniel. No, you're right. This would have included their families, not just them. Verse 6, the king continues, "But if ye show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof." He said, "No, I'm not going to tell you what the dream was. You tell me. If you don't do it, it's off with your head. But if you do it, it's gifts, rewards, and great honor that will be lauded upon you." Verse 7. Don't you imagine they were kind of antsy by this point? I reckon so. They answered again and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it." They're not going to let go of that, because they know that's what everything hinges on. "King, just go ahead and tell us what the dream was, and then we promise we'll tell you what it means." They know their goose is cooked, because if they get the dream wrong, it's off with their heads, and the whole family too.
Why would the king expect them to interpret a dream that they've never heard?
That's a good question. Mary asks, why would the king expect them to interpret a dream that he hadn't even told them what he dreamed? Mary, I think it has to do with what these men had made themselves out to be all along. They had made themselves out to be astrologers, magicians, sorcerers, learned men. They had claimed to have special gifts and abilities, senses, if you would, that nobody else in the realm among common men had. They had claimed to have special abilities. And you're exactly right. And because they had made those special claims for themselves, they had been treated very well. And as Milton said, they'd been living high on the hog. And now the king's saying, okay, I've been treating you like royalty. Let's put your money where your mouth is. Let's see if you can really do what you claimed you could do all along. So he's not going to tell them. In fact, he can't tell them what the dream was. He's forgotten it. You know, that's what happens to me too. TR asks me a lot of times when I get up, he said, what'd you dream last night? And I have to tell him, I have no idea. Because as soon as my eyes open, I've forgotten everything I was dreaming most of the time. That's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He woke up in a fright, but he couldn't remember what the bad dream was. Verse 8, the king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time, because ye see the thing is gone from me. He said, you want me just to wait until I remember what it was so you can buy yourself some more time. I know what you're doing. You want to put it off on me. Verse 9, but if ye will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. He said, if I go ahead and tell you what the dream is, you're just going to make up something and say, this is what it means, O king. He said, we're not doing that. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof. He said, you bunch of magicians and astrologers, you tell me what the dream was, because if you can tell me what I dreamed, I have no doubt you can also tell me what it means. He's putting them on the spot here. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asked such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. Mary, they said the same thing you said. How could anybody do this? No king ever asked his wise men to do such a thing before. And it is a rare thing that the king requireth. And there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. They said only the gods could answer this for you. And gods are not in flesh and body. For this cause, the king was angry and very furious. I can just imagine his face turning redder and redder and redder as they say, we can't answer this. And commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. He said, okay, I'll just get rid of you all. You're all a bunch of phonies. You're all a bunch of hypocrites. None of you can do what you say you can do. You've just been living off the good of the king for far too long like a bunch of parasites. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. Apparently, the king has ordered that all the wise men everywhere in the empire are to be rounded up wherever they are and killed. Now, the king is here in Babylon. And the soothsayers and the astrologers he's called unto him are the ones undoubtedly that live right around the palace. They're kind of the head honchos of all the Chaldeans and the astrologers and the magicians. But there would have been magicians and astrologers and Chaldeans that were in all the cities throughout the Babylonian Empire as advisors wherever they were sent to help rule. He said, go get all of them. All over the empire. All of them are to be killed. They're all a bunch of frauds. So we don't know where Daniel and his three companions were at the time, but they're going to be rounded up in whatever city or village they were, just like all the others. Verse 14, then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? You see, Daniel undoubtedly was probably not in Babylon at the time. He didn't even know what was going on. No one knew about this except that handful of men that were called in before the king. So Daniel is asking, why are we all being rounded up? Why has the king made so hasty a decision? What's going on? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Verse 16. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. So Daniel goes in by permission, of course, and says, King, we didn't know about this, but if you'll give me time, I will tell you the interpretation of it. Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So Daniel goes back and he and the three get together for a prayer meeting that night. They pray and pray and pray, and the Lord reveals to Daniel the dream and the interpretation in a night vision. You say, is that a dream? Well, it's a night vision. Perhaps it's a dream, perhaps he's still awake, but God reveals it to him in a vision here. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known to us the king's matter. Daniel says, Lord, only you could have done this. He blesses the name of God. He thanks the God of heaven for revealing what he has revealed so that Daniel and his three companions will be spared. They'll not all be slain like the king intends to do with the wise men of Babylon. That brings us down to verse 24. Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. And he went and said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste. I guess he did do it in a hurry because the king had ordered them to all be killed. Better do this quickly. And said thus unto him, verse 25, I have found a man of the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, that's his changed name, that's his Babylonian name, Art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, The secret which the king hath demanded, cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king. But, there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, Thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. So Daniel says to the king, he said, all of your wise men, all of your astrologers, all of your magicians, they can't tell you what you want to know. He said, but there's a God in heaven who can, who revealeth secrets. He will make known to you the dream and the interpretation thereof. He said, it's not for me. I'm just a man like any other. Daniel is giving God all the credit. I think there's a lesson to be learned there. He wants to make sure that Nebuchadnezzar realizes what he's about to hear is from God, not from Daniel. We need to be careful to give God the credit for miracles that God does too, not try to take the credit ourselves. And now we're all anxious to find out what the dream is that the king had about the end times, future events, and what it means. But we're out of time, so we'll have to wait until next week. That's right, it's going to be several weeks. You'll have to wait. Next week we have a singing, and the week after that we have the ladies from the Potter's House that'll be with us. But the following week we'll see this dream, and I promise you'll find it interesting. Let's pray. Father, thank you for a chance to study your word. And dear God, I pray that you'd help us to be more excited than ever about studying your word. Help us to do it on our own. And Lord, help us to encourage others to want to study your book. Dear God, help us to truly be a people of the book, to learn it, to live it, to put hands and feet about our knowledge that others might see something different in us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.